So I'm going to talk about forensic voice comparison and automatic speaker recognition. The reason being that the technology side, they're essentially the same. When we look at forensic aspects, we have specific requirements which essentially guide how we use the software, shall we say. I would pitch this as an application of artificial intelligence because we're trying to do something that humans do and we're trying to do it better for some sense. And we'll talk a bit about perhaps what we mean by better as we go through. So if I've got time, I'd like to talk about, well, give you an overview of the technology. I'd like to talk a bit about the specific concerns we have in forensics, and maybe throw out one or two comments at the end about how perhaps we can relate some of these things to AI more generally. So this is me. I work, as you said, in the forensic data science and the forensic speech science labs at Aston University. And we sit between the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics and the School of Computer Science. And just a quick plug for the area I worked in before, which is Think Beyond Data project at Aston. If you've not heard of this and you're an SME in the West Midlands area of the UK, then look these up because you can get some free consultancy in AI and data analytics and things like that. So in our labs, well, we're working in an environment. There's a new paradigm or paradigm shift in the way forensic evidence is evaluated, moving away from the kind of trust me, I'm an expert approach to very much a data-driven, objective approach. So we're pushing things like quantifying the strength of evidence, and I'll talk about that, use of data, measurements, and statistical modeling. Validation, and this is quite critical and quite forensic specific, under conditions reflecting the case that we're applying to. So not building general models, we're trying to apply them to a specific case to answer a specific question. And there's some process things around there as well about how humans use the system and ensure we don't bring biases in from the human point of view. We're working in a number of areas, so I was interested to see GATE come up before. We're not actually working in GATE at the moment, but we're working in areas such as DNA, firearms. So does this bullet come from this gun? Speech science, obviously. We're also interested in how we actually communicate use of such systems and the outputs they produce to courts, and some standards development and so on. So before I do any of that, I want to talk a bit about context. The reason for the CSI picture is that probably everything you know about forensic science, if you've gained it from TV shows like this, is wrong or at least twisted. And we'll note some of those things as we go through, I guess. But a couple of things to think about then. If Perisher thought you were up in court and there was, and you were accused of some crime, and there was an audio recording, perhaps from a police phone tap or perhaps a mobile phone that had been left somewhere. And there was also the police would have an interview with you as well. So you have two audio recordings. I wonder if you'd prefer to have a human compare those recordings. And essentially we're trying to say, is that question recording from the phone tap? Is that you on that call? Or would you prefer to have an AI do that comparison? And if you chose the AI, then think about what sort of requirements you want from the AI system. What would you want to know about it? Maybe how it works or how it's making its decision. And the same question, if you want the human to make that judgment, what would you expect of the human in terms of perhaps their characteristics or behaviors? The second thing to think about is, why is it difficult? So we have that audio recording, which is question speaker, which is perhaps from that mobile phone that's left at the scene of the crime. Maybe it's quite muffled, maybe it's noisy, it's been recorded on a mobile phone. And we have a different type of recording from a police interview. That might be quite clean, quite a good recording. There could be some reverberation because it may be recorded in a small room at a police station, for example. So what's hard about the task of comparing those two recordings and saying whether they're the same speaker or not? And probably the main thing is there's a lot of variability in speech. So different people speak in different ways for reasons, their language, their accents, their gender, and so on. And there's also a lot of variation in the way each of us speaks at any given time. So I speak in a certain way now because I'm trying to give a talk. I'd speak in a different way in a pub. I'd speak in a different way again if I was ill. You know, all these things change, and the content of what I say affects how I speak. The second slightly more technical issue is we have recordings of different lengths. So those two recordings I mentioned might be different lengths. We want to compare them. But also, unlike automatic speech recognition, where we're trying to pull information out in a kind of sequence of sounds, and that is a longer sequence, depending on how long the recording is. In this case, we want to take a recording of an arbitrary length and compare it with another recording of arbitrary length. And we want to extract something from that whole recording about the speaker that let us identify the speaker. And the third area is that mismatch. So I tried to set it up. So there was a mobile phone recording, which is probably poor quality. There was a police recording, which is probably good quality. But we want to discard that information somehow and just get at the information about the speaker. So at that base, what is the problem we're trying to address? And this is where some of the differences come in between automatic speaker recognition and the forensic voice comparison. So in speaker recognition, we're probably trying to do a classification task. So typically we'd have a speaker identification system, and we want it to tell us, is this speaker A or speaker B or speaker C, based on the audio that we give it. Speaker verification is similar, but maybe with a binary output. So might be a security system, and we want to say, yes, it is you, we'll let you in, or no, it's not you. But it's again, classification. And we're making a decision then about we want the system to make a decision about the speaker. The forensic voice comparison, we're explicitly not trying to make a decision. That's not the role of a forensic scientist. It's the role of a court. What we're trying to do is supply information to the court, which will help them make a decision. So mathematically, in classification, we're trying to obtain perhaps a probability of the hypothesis, what the speaker is, given the data that we've seen. Whereas in the forensic science, we're turning that around. So we want to say something about the data, given the hypothesis, and we'll obtain a number which is bigger than 0. And I'll come on to those things. So explicitly, we want to calculate the weight of the evidence, and you give that to the court to help them in their decision-making process. And what we're going to do is compare two mutually exclusive hypotheses about those two recordings. And we're going to present that as like a likelihood ratio, which I'll talk about in a couple of slides' time. So the simplest sense, we want to say, we want one hypothesis that the observed properties of the voice on the question speaker recording are more likely if it was produced by the known speaker, or that is you in the police cell. All the observed properties are more likely it was produced by some other speaker selected at random for the relevant population. And this concept of the relevant population is very important in forensics. So there's no point if I speak with a Birmingham accent, there's no point in me comparing with a population of people with a Scottish accent and say how likely it is that it's one of those random speakers, because then we'll produce misleading information for the court. And in fact, in forensic voice comparison, we ask a subtly different question or subtly different hypotheses, which just allow us to use the data more effectively. So we're not focusing on the way I speak, but we're looking at pairs and saying, how likely is it the observed properties are more likely if they were both produced by the same speaker, selected at random, or if they were both produced by different speakers, selected at random. And if in a particular case, we know one of the recordings was made by me in that police interview, and then we're essentially asking the same question. So the likelihood ratio allows us to express those two hypotheses as a number bigger than 1. So it's literally just a ratio of some function of the data which we're going to measure, given the hypothesis that the recordings came from the same speaker, divided by that same function or a different function that they came from different speakers. And just compare that as before with a classifier, which turns that round the other way into a probability, makes a decision. So just to try and explain that likelihood ratio slightly further, imagine we have some way of measuring a pair of audio recordings. And so this red line shows the distribution of the values we might get if 2 recordings were from the same speaker. And the blue shows if they were from a different speaker. So we've got more variability in the blue because that's across all the speakers we're interested in, whereas the variation within a certain speaker is going to be smaller, so we've got a narrow distribution. And in this case, if we measured at about 64, we see it's much more likely that they came from the same speaker versus different speakers. So we have a likelihood ratio bigger than 1, because a large number divided by a small number gives us a number bigger than 1. And we say the evidence then points towards these being from the same speaker. Conversely, if it's the other way around, likelihood ratio less than 1 points towards being different speaker. Likelihood ratio around about 1, we say, well, it doesn't really tell us much. So this particular comparison doesn't provide much evidence. We would still present that to the court because it's still of interest and it still helps them in their decision-making process. Essentially, we're saying we can't say much about these recordings. But if you're over here and you said the evidence points strongly towards the same speaker, the court might come along and say, well, we've got some other evidence. So there's a strong alibi, for example, that points to it being a different speaker. And then those pieces of evidence will be combined and could be combined numerically to help the court come to the right decision. Oh, sorry. So finally, we come to the technology. So how do we get from 2 audio recordings on a mobile phone, whatever it might be, to that likelihood ratio number? And the answer is essentially we're going to use a fairly complex machine learning pipeline, and we're going to put the recordings through these various stages. And I'll go through these fairly quickly, one by one. So we'll start off by processing the two recordings separately, essentially to extract features that will allow us to compare them. And then we put them into some back-end modeling, statistical modeling, to actually perform the comparison and produce a likelihood ratio. So we're going to start by taking the audio, applying some acoustic feature extraction, essentially to get a series of numbers, features that the machine learning can handle. But the key part is probably this X vector extraction, which is a deep neural network approach to then combine that and produce a high level feature that will be a fixed length vector that will represent the whole audio recording. We pass it into a linear discriminant analysis, which partly allows us to reduce the dimensionality and partly helps to remove some of that mismatch between the conditions on the 2 recordings so we can compare them more directly. Probabilistic linear discriminant analysis then takes both of those vectors as inputs and produces a likelihood ratio, essentially. But we then have to go into a further stage, which is to calibrate the whole system. And I'll talk about that a bit a little later on. This is just to say that before X vectors came along in the last few years, the dominant approach was the so-called I vector, which is another way of producing a fixed length vector representing a recording. But this time it was a generative model, as was discussed a bit earlier. So this attempted to model the variability in between speakers and within speakers and to do to record recording conditions, model that explicitly, and then extracts a low dimensional vector from a subset of that space. I won't talk about this any much more, except to say that this is still competitive in certain conditions, but mostly the state of the art is this X vector approach. The key to all of this is that everything we're trying to do in this pipeline is to enhance the between speaker differences whilst reducing the within speaker differences and also remove the effects of the recording condition. So essentially all we really want is to know about what characterizes a speaker and use that to compare the 2 recordings. So we start with acoustic feature extraction. I don't want to say too much about this, except we use the same approach as we'd use in automatic speech recognition. So we'll digitally sample a signal. We'll take very short windows which overlap and treat each of those as a fixed point. We'll apply a Fourier transform, which allows us to extract the key frequencies at that point in the signal, and we'll use that to characterize the signal at that point. And we'll do that as we go through the whole signal from start to end. So we'll end up with a sequence of feature vectors of a relatively low dimension, so 40 to 80 dimensions. And sometimes we'll go on further then to apply a bit further processing, but we'll still end up with a sequence of low dimensional features, which describes the audio. At this point, how long that sequence is depends on how long the recording is. The key point, as I said then, is this X vector extraction. And to do this, we use a particular kind of deep neural network, which is trained to classify speakers. So we'll pass in those audio features at the bottom. We'll focus on each frame in turn, and then we'll pass information up through the network. And as we pass up through the network, that network will expand the context in time that it looks at, and it'll be aggregating information across time, here up to a window of +7, -7 features. And then it'll continue to pass it up a bit further through the network. It will shift the whole network will pass across the whole audio recording and apply that processing until we get to the so-called statistics pooling layer. And at this point, information has been gathered from the whole audio recording. And this, in the simplest sense, calculates a mean and a standard deviation for each channel across all of those process features that have been through all these non-linearities up to this point. And at this point, we have a fixed dimension vector, which is capturing information from the whole recording. That's passed up through a few more layers of processing until the network is able to classify. So if you give it a recording here, it's going to classify a speaker. So we'll have an output for every speaker that it's been trained on. And we'll train this system on a a very large and diverse pool of audio recordings from many speakers in many recording conditions, probably with multiple recordings from each speaker. So the network is going to somehow learn in a very general sense what speech is and what's important in that speech that relates to the speaker, and hopefully to discard irrelevant information along the way. And we usually take a couple of steps back and introduce a bottleneck layer. So this will be about 500 neurons or so. And this is what we read our X vector off. So once we train the system, we present it with a new audio recording, which we pass the network across that recording. And we read off the activations at this layer, and that is our X vector. So that's now a fixed dimensional vector, which somehow represents a recording, and it's a pair of those that we're going to compare in the latter stages of the pipeline. So then we come to score those. As I said, we would reduce the dimensionality, and also, because of the way LDA works, take out some of the mismatch and conditions that we're not interested in, and we'll pass it into this PLDA system. Now, this is also a generative model. It's very like linear discriminant analysis that allows us to build a model that we can then give new information to and extract a likelihood ratio. So this is essentially calculating a joint probability of the two X vectors, so one from the known speaker recording and one from the question speaker recording, under those two hypotheses. So perhaps the red distribution here is the distribution associated with same speaker recordings, and the blue one is the distribution associated with different speaker recordings. And we can read off of this an attempt to calculate a likelihood ratio using those two vectors for those hypotheses. Some of the approaches to automatic speaker recognition will just calculate a distance between two vectors. The key thing for us about PLDA is it allows us to take into account similarity and typicality. So those two distributions I showed you. So here we've measured two X vectors, if you like, two values. They're obviously very close together, but they're very close together on both the single speaker and the general speaker distributions. Whereas over here, we have the same distance between our two measurements, but they're very close together, or they're very typical for a single speaker, but they're way out on the tail of this measurement. So this perhaps is the way I speak, and there's two recordings and they're very similar, but perhaps I speak very differently from the general population of interest in this case. And so intuitively, we can see that these two situations are giving us different information. And PLDA takes this into account when it's calculating its likelihood ratio. Unfortunately, we still have a problem. So we have a very complicated pipeline with lots and lots, thousands, millions of parameters. And we've made some modeling assumptions here. So LDA and PLDA, for example, assume Gaussian distributions, and maybe those weren't true. So the final step then is to say, well, we don't quite trust this output as a likelihood ratio. We're going to calibrate the whole system. So we treat this all as a black box and train a very simple model here. So perhaps logistic regression or even just a pair of Gaussians. At this stage, we need data. So we need pairs of recordings where one is in a known speaker condition, like that mobile phone recording. One is in a question speaker condition, like the one taken in the police cell. And we need lots of examples where we know some of these pairs are from the same speaker and some are from different speaker. And then we use that data set to train this calibration model. So we essentially will put these all into the system. We'll take these scores that come out and we'll try and map those to a 1 or a 0 as to whether they're the same speaker or different speaker. And the key here is that this is a parsimonious model. So we're not trying to train too many parameters. And so we need a relatively small amount of data. But one of the key issues we have in forensic science is collecting this kind of data or determining ways in which we can take clean recordings, for example, and simulate these conditions so that we train something here that will give us a likelihood ratio that we can believe and then give to court. And this is pretty much what I've just said. So we might have two Gaussians, model our known speaker scores, our different speaker scores, and read off a likelihood ratio. Typically, we'd use a logistic regression because it comes with slightly different or reduced assumptions. And all we're really doing is learning a way of shifting and scaling those scores. So you can think about calibration as if you might have a friend who's a pessimist and you ask him what the weather's going to be like tomorrow. And you know that if he says it's bound to rain, then it's probably only maybe 80% chance of it raining. Or if he says that it's 50-50 tomorrow, you might know that really that means there's just a 20% chance of it raining tomorrow. So you're going to shift and scale your belief in the output, what he tells you, based on what you know about him. This is essentially doing the same thing. So it's saying, I don't quite believe those scores, but using information that I've gathered, I can train a system to calibrate, to shift those in a certain sense. So if that's a whiz through of the technology we use, what are some of the specific concerns we have in forensics? And I guess I've touched on some of these already. The critical thing is that we have to give our results to a court, and the court has to be able to trust that output, which essentially means if we give them a likelihood ratio that says it's twice as likely that these two recordings came from a single speaker versus different speakers, that likelihood ratio must mean what it says, and that's part of what calibration is trying to do for us. And this criticality has implications for data and for some of the processes we use. So historically, I touched on this at the beginning, there's a lot of subjectivity, and partly because at that time we didn't have the data, we didn't have the computational power to do some of what we're trying to do now. So there was a lot of reliance on experts, perhaps over-reliance. There were experts overstating the confidence in what the information they're giving the court. There's been some pseudoscience along the way, so you can go and read about miscarriages of justice in bite marks. And there's issues around processes. So we're trying to bring objectivity to all of this. I think perhaps there's four things I would highlight as critical, which I've mentioned already to some extent. The first thing is data. I mentioned that we have to collect data that's relevant to the case, and we need to train parts of the system in the right sort of data. So we train the earlier parts, the X vector extractor, with a generic set of data. But then as we get nearer the decision-making point, and especially when we're building that calibration model, we need to make sure we use data that reflects the situations, the characteristics and the population of the recordings in the case. And there's research questions then about how do we know what type of data to use, and how do we know that our data is close enough? The key thing is, as I said, that we estimate that typicality aspect, so the denominator, how likely it is the recordings came from a different person in the relevant population. There are subjective decisions to be made here. Largely these come towards the start of the process, so we're moving them away from the point at which we're actually making decisions, so we don't influence those decisions. Calibration I've already talked about. Again, I just want to highlight that when we calibrate the system, it's critical that we use data that reflects the population and conditions in the case. The third area is more about process. This is where the humans interact with the AI, if you like, and that's avoiding cognitive bias. So part of that, as I said, we don't give a decision to the court, we give them this weight of evidence. Part of that is making sure the human involvement is towards the start of the pipeline. So we have to personally choose the data to use, but the rest of the modeling is objective. Part of it is asking who needs to do certain things. So who needs to listen to the known speaker recordings and the question speaker recording? Someone needs to do that to determine the type of data we need, but does it have to be one person? Can it be two people? And these sorts of questions come into the way we use the system, essentially being careful and thinking about the potential for bias at different stages. And the fourth thing, which I've not mentioned, is then black box validation. So this relates to what we said about calibration, but once we have our full system trained on, and we've made decisions about what data to use, and we believe it is going to be appropriate for answering the question in the case, we then want to take some more data and validate how the system performs on that data. So again, we take pairs of recordings where we know whether they're from the same speaker or different. And we have one recording in the conditions of the questioned speaker recording, and one in the conditions of the known speaker recording. And then we pass all of those through the entire system, including calibration, and we see what likelihood ratio it pulls out. And so we know if we have same source pairs, we're going to expect a high likelihood ratio. So this is blue line. If we have different source pairs, we're going to expect a low likelihood ratio. And that's just red line. And there's variability here, all down to the variability we have in those audio recordings. But we can use a tippet plot like this to visualize roughly how the system's performing. So we don't know if when we apply this to a new case, we would expect a likelihood ratio somewhere in this range. And if you get one that's sort of way out to the left or way out to the right, we know we've got a problem. And we can determine things from this about how the system's performing overall. And then this scary looking formula is really just saying we can take an average of all of these likelihood ratios and have a metric that tells us how the system performs. And if we get a cost of likelihood ratio which is near 0, we know we've got a useful system. As this heads towards 1, we know it's giving us less useful information. Now, I think I'm probably running out of time, so I'll just throw, if I have over my time, then just tell me to shut up.
You're good. No,
okay.
You're good.
So just trying to draw out 1 or 2 more general things as to whether some of these aspects we're looking at in forensics are useful to think about perhaps in other areas of AI, and particularly around bias and around interpretability of systems. So the first thing I would say is, we could discuss this, I suppose, but there's no intelligence here. This is really just data processing, at least from the technical point of view. I would say all the intelligence in this system comes from the human aspect, how we use it. So things like how we choose the data, how we train the system, and how we interpret the results. And that means that all the problems in the system come from the human as well. But society, as we know, does have valid concerns about bias in artificial intelligence systems, and there's also concerns related to that about how we can interpret these systems. And you probably recognize some of these pictures. As regards interpretability, so Einstein has this famous quote, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. We could discuss whether that's true regarding AI systems. I found this interpretable AI company just a couple of days ago. On the front page of their website, they say this: you can't depend on an AI system you don't understand. Now, I think we could dispute this because, well, this is the sort of thing that courts get hung up on. They want to say, well, we don't understand the AI system, so we're not going to trust its output. But we could ask them whether they understand an aeroplane, for instance, whether they would use that. So I think there's something about AI and smart technology that is, because it's new, people feel they should understand it in detail. But I think there's certain key things that come out of what we talked about, perhaps that maybe we could apply elsewhere. So obviously, it's important to think about the data. So we know that often it's data that brings the bias into the system. So if you train on the wrong data, then you're going to get the wrong outputs, garbage in, garbage out. But obviously biases that we introduce into some of these systems are more subtle than that. So in forensics, we're interested in who selects the data, at what point in the process are those decisions made. And as I said, there's research questions then about how that data is appropriate to the system, whether it's the right data. Indeed, how do we measure whether a data set is right and how close is it to the conditions of the case, and how much data we need? So these are the sort of questions that we're interested in more broadly. In terms of validation, this comes back then to that question of understanding the system, I think, and providing trust to the courts in our case. We use black box validation as a way to essentially say, well, you don't have to understand how the system works, but we can demonstrate from this experiment we've run using it on this known data that it does a good job, that it will produce a result you can trust. So maybe this is an approach that can be used elsewhere. Perhaps not everywhere. You can't always collect data and experiment upon it. Perhaps it's one approach to starting to mitigate those concerns about bias and about understanding the system. And calibration is kind of similar. So it's interesting to note we could calibrate the human experts. We could ask an expert to perform lots and lots of comparisons and see how well they perform. That's unlikely to be feasible due to time and cost. But it's certainly in forensics, it's always feasible for us as long as we can collect the right sort of data. And again, the same questions arise: is it always possible to do that? Is this a valid approach in other areas of AI? Would it allow us to correct for biases? So perhaps we know we've got a biased system because of the data we have available, but can we then calibrate that in the same way, perhaps with another layer of processing? And again, do we need to understand what the system's doing, or can we pass over that because we can see how it performs? And again, how does the AI relate to the people who use it? So from the technologist, how do we train the system? In our case, from the courts, how do we use the system? So we have to train the system in the right way. Again, we have to use the right data. We have to avoid bias in the way we select our data or train parts of the system. And that might be avoiding knowing things we don't need to know. and the court needs to make sure they interpret the results in the right way. So you need to know what that number, a likelihood ratio 2, what does that actually mean? And again, perhaps this is relevant to other areas of AI, other complex AI processing. This comes to the relationship, I suppose, between the technology and the user, the human side. And I guess for me, that's where a lot of the interest comes in artificial intelligence. There's a lot of human factors, which, as I said earlier, probably in a sense, where the intelligence comes into the system, and perhaps affect the way we develop AI, the way we use AI, more than just the pure technology for its own sake. So those are really just some thoughts at the end that perhaps we want to take into discussion or take away to think about further. I'm certainly happy to have a chat offline with anybody about some of these things. But I think that's it. Otherwise, thank you.
That was fascinating. I really enjoyed that. Thank you, Phil.